Good afternoon. How are you guys doing today? How has it been for you so far, gathering together? All right, great. My name is Joseph White. I am a child psychologist from Austin, Texas. And even before I got here today, it was really good to be in Minnesota today because today in Austin it is 106 degrees outside. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm also very happy to be here with a bunch of early childhood educators. As I mentioned, I'm a child psychologist, so you might feel like, oh, this is going to be one of those academic talks. And we will talk about some of that, because I want to talk about the science about what works and why, but then I also want to get into the really practical stuff, because I know that's the stuff that you can use. But the practical stuff should always follow from the science. We should do what we know is effective. And that changes over time because we're always learning more. We're always learning more. I do have a little bit of practical experience. I was a preschool teacher during my undergraduate years, and I also taught, pre-K in between undergraduate and graduate school. So I haven't, my wife has much more experience than me though. And so for some of the practical stuff, I also draw on her work, 20 years as an early childhood educator and administrator. So I want to begin with a preschool vocabulary quiz. As you know, many of you know anyway, young children sometimes speak a slightly different language, or at least a slightly different dialect, right? And so how many of you have been involved in early childhood education for 10 years or more? You guys are going to ace this quiz. You're going to know this stuff. How many for between 5 and 10 years? How many of you are brand new at this? Oh, okay. So you guys are going to have to help them in the back over there, okay? I'm sorry?
Having our own children, does that count?
Well, of course it counts to have your own children. Absolutely. All right, so here's our first vocabulary word. Let's see if you know what it means. This is an easy one. I threw an easy one. Paschetti, what is this? Spaghetti, right, yeah. So that was just to get you used to it, okay? So here's another one. This might not be so obvious. What are crowns? Oh, wow, you guys are good. Okay, crayons. You color with crowns. Okay. What about probably? Probably, as in I'll probably go to Disneyland this weekend. Wishful thinking, right? If I say it enough, it might be true. You know. So many preschoolers and even some political candidates think that that's true. Okay. This one, somebody stole my thunder. Bridget stole my thunder last session. Because now you guys know what Alimento is. What is it? It's the 12th letter of the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, Alimento, P. Right, the 12th letter of the alphabet. We got 2 more. How about this one? This one might come up if you ever recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Or as kids call it, what? The Pledge of Allegiance, right? If you ever recite that, they might say, "in liberty and justice for all." With liberty and justice for all. Okay, liberty doesn't sound very good to me. All right, last one. This is my favorite. This doesn't say footsie. Read it carefully. Fusti. I'm fusti. Teacher, I'm fusti. If you hear somebody say, "I'm fusti," what does that mean? They need something to drink, right? They're thirsty. Good, you guys are good at this. You know, I didn't expect any less from Minnesota, I have to tell you the truth. Minnesota has the premier reputation in the United States for child development and child development research and child development practice. So I know you guys are good. In fact, I hope that I can tell you something today that you don't already know. I'll try. If anything else, it'll be affirming. I have to confess, though, sometimes when I give this talk that I'm going to give today, it makes people mad, too. So I hope I don't make anybody mad. I gave this talk one time at the Ohio Catholic Education Association, and this poor teacher stood up, kindergarten teacher, and said, "Dr. White, you're saying that everything I'm doing in my classroom is wrong." And I said, "Ma'am, I don't know you or anything that you do in your classroom. I'm not saying that at all. I'm presenting to you the research about what we're learning, about what works. And if there's anything here that you can use, then great. And if not, that's fine. I also won't know what you do in your classroom after I give this talk either, so it's fine. But I think this might go down a little bit easier here in Minnesota. I hope so. Oh, we had one more. I'm sorry. Does anybody know what this one is? Right. You know, if you're clapping and then snapping and clapping and snapping and clapping and snapping, then it's a pattern, right? It's a pattern. They might not be able to snap yet, but they would recognize the pattern there, right? Okay. So there have been some changes in preschool and kindergarten education in the last generation in the United States. What we're seeing is that it's becoming increasingly academic in nature, driven at least in part by performance measures during the elementary years. And so I always have a good question, and maybe it's because I'm a psychologist, because I know Dr. Phil used to ask this question on his show too, right? If people were talking about something that they were doing, and lo and behold, they're on the Dr. Phil show, so he knew the answer to this, but he always asks what? Well, how's that working for you, right? So is it working that we're getting increasingly academic in the early childhood years, that we're so concerned about what they do later that we kind of push the academic instruction down into the early childhood years? Is it working? Well, the best measure we have of whether this is working or not is when we look at kids at the end of their academic career, or toward the end of their academic career, at least before they go off to college, in high school, how are they doing now with this different kind of foundation in early childhood? Well, the Program for International Student Assessment compares countries around the world and how well educated their kids are once they reach high school. And, you know, I like the United States, and I know that we're number one in some things, including gymnastics, thank you. But here's how we're doing in these subject areas. We are number 34 in mathematics, yay! We're number 34. No, not so good, right? We are number 16 in science, a little bit better, but really not so good. We have well-funded sciences in the United States. Why are we number 16? And then we're a little better, but number 9 in reading. Almost all the research on reading education happens in the United States. Why are we number 9 in reading, right? This is sad. It's dismal, I think. And I see in some areas us moving further down those lists every time the results come out. This study's done about every 7 years. This is the 2022 data, so it's not that old yet. But this is where we are today. And so my question is why? Why do we keep falling behind no matter how hard we try, no matter how much more we try to pack into early childhood? You know, we're trying to do the pre-algebra with those pre-K4 kids. What's happening here? Two major differences were cited by researchers analyzing the PSIA data. One is that the students in highest performing countries are much more motivated to learn and achieve. They feel more excited about doing this stuff. Why is that? And second, students in high-performing countries appear to have better higher-order thinking skills. For example, they're more adept at problem solving and critical thinking. That part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for executive functions, seems to be more well-developed in students in other countries than in the United States. What is that all about? Let's see if we can figure that out. All right. So what makes us continue to remain stagnant or even fall behind in educational rankings of industrialized nations despite the money and energy spent on educational reforms, initiatives, and methodologies? What are we missing, and how can we do things better beginning in the early childhood years? Here's what's holding us back. We're ignoring what science tells us about the developing brain. Current research doesn't agree with our preconceived notions of what it will take to give our children the best chance of success. And so we keep on doing what's not working. I'm going to begin with the research that started with the end of the last presentation. Remember how NRP, the 5 components of literacy education, came out right around 2000, right? So the research led up to that. We identified those 5 components of literacy education. But those 5 components didn't tell us when to start, those 5 components that were identified. They didn't tell us exactly how to start in early childhood either. So I'm going to begin with research that started right there, and then the research that follows, beginning with the work of Dr. Rebecca Marcon at the University of North Florida. One of the things that Dr. Marcon noticed was, and in fact, this is so well known that there's a nickname for it, across the country, there are some 4th graders that really succeed and other 4th graders that just kind of slump. And they might have been doing okay all the way up until 4th grade, and then they kind of seem to bottom out. This is where things seem to be going wrong. And Dr. Marcon, as an early childhood educator and researcher, was curious. Is there anything we can do in early childhood that would have any impact at all on this 4th grade slump? Can we somehow prepare our younger kids better going into those 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade years, so that by the time they get to 4th grade, they're not just kind of bottoming out? And so she looked at different methods of preschool education. She was working in the Washington, D.C. public schools and looked at 3 different preschool models. One was child-initiated classrooms. Now, in these classrooms, these are really fun to work in. These are classrooms where mostly kids guide themselves through learning activities. Now, if I said that and you thought of Montessori, Montessori is a method where kids guide themselves through learning activities, but that's not what we're talking about here. So in most child-initiated classrooms, there are also a lot of open-ended kinds of activities. There's not a lot of open-ended stuff in Montessori. There are good things about it, but that's one thing that it doesn't do very much. So in a child-initiated classroom, you might walk in, and maybe some of your classrooms are just like this. You would see very purposeful learning centers around the room. It's been well thought out. You know, there are different things we're trying to accomplish in each center on a particular day or in a particular week. And kids might, a few at a time, guide themselves through those learning centers. So maybe there's a class meeting, maybe there's a circle on the floor. You have a circle time, you talk about what's in the different centers. You might even demonstrate something that they would do in one of those centers. Then you might have a time where they split off into the centers, and you want to make sure those kids rotate through the centers, right? And so you know that they have their favorite ones and the ones they never go to. And so maybe there are some little Velcro spaces there, and they have a Velcro thing with their name on it, and you call them one by one, and you call those kids that always go to the block center, you call them last, because by then the block center will be taken, and they'll have to choose something else because you want them to branch out a little bit, right? And so then they find a center with a spot, and they're there, and there's some rotation that happens through those learning centers. But kids are mostly directing their learning. That's a child-initiated classroom. In the academically directed classroom, this is one where kids might sit mostly at tables or even desks. They're mostly doing activities that are initiated by the teacher. The teacher gives directions, the kids do the activity. A lot of times people are working together, or they might be working in small groups, but they're still adult-facilitated small groups. Teacher says what to do, the kids do the stuff, right? And then you have the third model, which is the middle of the road. In the middle of the road classroom, there might be some center and child-initiated work, and there might also be some teacher-directed work, right? And so you know the idea is, let's try to get the best of both worlds there. So Rebecca Marcon was looking at these 3 different models, and her question was, where do kids master the most skills in their early learning? In what kind of classroom do they walk away with the skill set that we like them to see in kindergarten? And even more importantly, beyond that, how are they doing once they get to 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and especially 4th grade? Is there any difference there when some of the kids just seem to bottom out? Is there any difference between these models in the kids that do and the kids that don't? Now, intuition might tell us, well, if they're working a lot in a systematic way on early skill building, maybe they'll have the skill set that they need and they won't bottom out in 4th grade. Let's see if that's true. All right, here are the initial results of the Marcon study. Children in the child-initiated model mastered more basic skills. So even though in the teacher model, they were really focused on those skills. They're saying, we're going to sit down and do these lessons. We're going to make sure everybody does them. The teacher's going to direct them. We're going to focus on these skills. Even though they did that in the teacher-directed model, in the child-initiated model, where they had these intentional learning centers set up and kids would walk themselves through it, they mastered it better. Can we trust the kids to learn this themselves? I don't know. But this is what happened. The middle-of-the-road model children were significantly behind the other children in the other 2 types of classrooms. So worst model is the most common one, middle of the road. They were significantly behind both of the others. Even the teacher-directed model, kids fared better than the middle-of-the-road model. They were significantly behind the other 2 types of classrooms in language, social and motor development, as well as overall adaptive functioning and mastery of basic skills. The middle-of-the-road model of instruction in preschool led to children remaining behind their peers as they moved into kindergarten and 1st grade. The child-initiated model children continued to excel in kindergarten and 1st grade. The children who had academically directed preschool classrooms declined in social development and mastery of 1st grade reading and math objectives. So by 1st grade, those kids were falling off. But here's the big kicker, the 4th grade transition. In that transition from 3rd to 4th grade, the kids in the academically oriented preschool classroom, those kids showed the greatest decline. A 22% decline in GPA, and this is the academically oriented preschool classroom, right? I mean, by 4th grade, all those classrooms are academically oriented unless they go to like a Waldorf school or something like that, right? But the kids that had been in an academically teacher-directed preschool, they showed the greatest decline. 22% decline in GPA, 32% decline in reading and language, 30% decline in spelling and social studies, 23% decline in science, 16% decline in health and PE. The long-term positive effects of the child-initiated model showed up most clearly during this transition. So I know you can't read this graph, but I think it's blue. I'm colorblind, but I think it's blue there on the right side. So this is a percent increase in achievement. This is a percent decrease in achievement. That blue is the child-initiated model. The kind of gold color, maybe, is the academically directed model, the greatest declines, and the other one is the middle-of-the-road model. And there's overall GPA, math, reading, language, spelling, social studies, science, handwriting, art, music, health and PE, and citizenship. This is how they fared. Now, you might say, well, this is just one study. That's true. So we'll have to look at some further research to see if that's been backed up since then as well. Interestingly, they've done similar research at Yale University Child Study Center. Dr. Erica Christakis at Yale has said the problem today is that many preschool classrooms are focusing on skills. Just read the first part of that sentence again. The problem today is that many preschool classrooms are focusing on skills rather than on the process of learning. It's through play and exploration and relationships that children develop these high-level skills that we need them to acquire. Let's talk a little bit more about that. The work of Whitebread and Bingham at Cambridge University. Whitebread and Bingham at Cambridge say developmental psychologists have identified 2 mental processes that underpin the relationship between play and learning. First, much of children's play involves pretending that one thing represents another. For example, that a cardboard box is a spaceship. And this ability is thought to be unique to humans and underpins language, drawing, and other ways in which we convey meaning. So that helps prepare the brain to look at one thing and understand that it can symbolize something else. Very important skill, especially in what subject? Reading, right? They have to be able to understand that the letters signify sounds. Also math, right? They have to be able to understand that the numbers and the signs signify equations. James Christie at Arizona State University and Kathleen Roscos at John Carroll University in Ohio have reviewed evidence that such an approach to language learning, the play-based approach to language learning, as opposed to formal instruction, offers the most powerful support for the early development of phonological and literacy skills. Now, I want to jump back to some points to remember about literacy skills that I think you heard in the last presentation. Reading is a combination of two elements. Remember that simple definition of reading, right? Two elements, the ability to read or decode and the ability to understand language. So the ability to decode depends on the ability to look at something symbolic and understand that it signifies something else. The ability to understand language now, according to researchers at Yale and Cambridge and John Carroll University and all of those Ivy League big name universities that have done research on this, depends mostly in early childhood on play-based interactions and child-directed learning. Reading is dependent on a series of complex interactions in various areas of the brain. You heard Bridget say that too. So brain development in early childhood is the critical variable here. We need to prep the neural pathways. I think that was the phrase that she used as well. The NRP's 5 components of effective literacy instruction that came out 24 years ago, they define the what. These are the critical elements in literacy instruction. But they don't tell us from the research when to introduce those elements, and they also don't tell us how to introduce them in the preschool years. So we've got to look at the research that's come out between 2000 and 2024 to get some insight on that. What we're talking about now is how timing of formal reading instruction relates to outcomes, especially outcomes beyond 4th grade. A lot of the research on literacy instruction really gives you results between 1st and 3rd grade, doesn't it? In fact, some of the research you saw already today showed you, results through 3rd grade. It doesn't tell us as much about what happens in 4th grade and beyond, but we do have some data about that, including the PSIA data that says that we somehow are falling way behind other industrialized nations on this. So what do we do then? Whitebread and Bingham, again from Cambridge, said also through all kinds of physical, constructional, and social play, children become more aware of and more in control of their physical and mental activity. This allows them to gradually rely less on adult support and become more self-regulating, both intellectually and emotionally. A growing number of empirical studies suggest that encouraging play early on enhances this ability and that educational interventions supporting play are the most powerful predictors of children's development as learners. Look at that again. Educational interventions supporting play are the most powerful predictors of children's development as learners when we look at the research over the last 25 years. Now, why would that be? First, let's talk about what happens in the 4th grade. So when we see that 4th grade slump, how is the 4th grade different from other grade levels? There probably are people in here who have taught elementary school grades as well, and not just the early childhood grades, which, by the way, are the most important learning years. You will, you will hear, and I'm not just saying that because of my audience. I would say that to a classroom of 4th grade teachers too. What you are doing in that school is more critical and more important than what any of those upper grade level teachers are doing, because you're forming the brains that they will need to do all of that other stuff, right? But those of you who have taught those upper grades, what's different about the 4th grade versus the 3rd, 2nd, 1st grade? What is it?
In 4th grade, you start reading to learn instead of learning to read.
But to read to learn, what do you need to be able to do? You need to be able to have some level of independent, self-guided learning, right? Yeah, you have to have that self-regulation. You have to be able to, so the big difference between 4th grade and the grade levels that lead up to it is that kids are called to do much more independent work. They have to sit and write and read and regulate themselves and monitor themselves and drive themselves much more through the learning process. Now, if we never built the architecture in the brain to do that, because we know that child-initiated learning and play in early childhood is what builds that part of the brain. If we never built the architecture to do that, if we focused instead on all the skills we wanted them to learn but never built that part of the brain, what happens? They might master some of those skills at first, not as well as the kids in the child-initiated classroom, but they master some of those skills at first. But it's like we built a house with no foundation. And that house falls apart when they get to 4th grade and they have to work independently. It's the self-regulation skills that they're missing. Now, what really concerns me as a child psychologist, and I've certainly seen this in my practice work as well, what really concerns me is that kids are playing much, much less today than they used to play, right? And when they do play, very little of it is creative and child-directed play. In fact, when you go to, I know Target is based here in Minnesota, when you go to Target and you look for toys, the toys are not, not generally a bunch of open-ended toys, are they? They're all organized according to what movie or what video game or, the theme. And more toys today are intended to be used according to predetermined scripts. Erica Christakis at Yale talks a lot about this too. So you don't have the same development of language that you used to have through play, because there's a right way to play the toy and there's a right way to put it together. Legos used to just be open-ended, and now you buy them in kits and there's a right way to put it together. This should concern us because it doesn't develop that part of the brain that they need to be able to do effective problem solving and impulse control and self-regulation. That part of the brain that's developed through child-initiated activity. So it's even more critical now that they have that child-initiated play in early childhood classrooms than it was back when Marcon did her study. It's even more critical now if we want those kids to achieve in those upper grades. Okay, let's talk some more about more evidence and more studies. So another important strand of evidence, a study of 3,000 children funded by the UK Department of Education, showed that an extended period of play-based preschool education made a significant difference to learning and well-being through the primary school years. In New Zealand, several key investigations compared children who started formal literacy lessons at age 5 with those who started at age 7. So we know the 5 components of literacy education. That science of reading stuff is solid. Anytime they do like a new gimmicky program to get away from those 5 components that you found first in Orton Gillingham and then in later evolutions of that, anytime they do reading programs that get away from that, we have a little, at least a micro generation of kids that falls behind in reading. That stuff is solid. We're not talking about the what now, we're talking about the when. So when we look at New Zealand, several key investigations compared children who started formal literacy lessons at age 5 with those who started at age 7. They showed that early formal learning doesn't improve reading development and may even be damaging. By the age of 11, there was no difference in reading ability level between the 2 groups. Do you want to work really hard for something that's not going to make a difference when they're 11? The kids that started at 5 in the formal literacy lessons, they matched the kids in reading ability as the kids that started at 7. In fact, all the countries that are ahead of us in reading, all of them start at 7 with formal literacy. All 8 of the countries that are ahead of us. By the age of 11, there was no difference in reading ability level between the 2 groups. However, those who started at age 5 developed less positive attitudes to reading and showed poor text comprehension than those who had started later on. Why would that be? So remember in the PSIA study, the big difference that was identified, that first big difference that was identified between the kids that really excelled, those countries that beat us, and us, the big difference? Lower motivation among our students. Look where it begins. Those who started at age 5, formal reading lessons, teacher-directed education, developed less positive attitudes to reading, showed poorer text comprehension than those started later. Let's talk about the comprehension side. Remember, 2 key components to reading: decoding the word and also understanding language, right? We know from the Yale University research that the key to understanding language in those early years are those extended periods of play-based education that include a lot of child-initiated activity. In fact, the reason, I've heard Erica Christakis talk about this, the reason that is because we have the development during those kinds of activities of something that Yale University calls private speech. It's a self-talk that builds those language areas of the brain, those language comprehension areas of the brain. And that's critical. And if they're doing this other formal workbooky stuff, they're not doing that because you have a limited amount of time, don't you, in your day. And each thing that you choose to do is also something you choose not to do. So here's the model of development I like to think about, because we're talking again about the brain-based skills. As Bridget said in her earlier presentation, what we're focusing on in early childhood is building those neural connections. We're trying to prep the brain for learning in those elementary school years. And so let's talk a little bit about how the brain is developing during these early childhood years. So Dr. Bruce Perry, is anybody familiar with his work? Anybody heard that name, Dr. Bruce Perry? So Dr. Bruce Perry is an expert on the neurosequential development of the brain. What order do the different areas of the brain develop in, and what does that connect with, right? So, so Dr. Perry is the one that, like, for example, when they find a kid who's been locked in a closet for 5 years, they interview Dr. Perry on CNN and they say, what does this do to the developing brain? He's worked with a lot of kids who have been severely neglected or, you know, otherwise had some kind of brain injury or things like that. But he also looks at, because in order to do that well, you have to know the typical developing brain, right? So a child that has the right kind of environmental stimuli, what does that brain look like? So brain development begins with the brainstem. In fact, if our brainstem is not well developed, we don't survive when we're born, because those are the essential functions. You know, the lower you go in the brain, the more essential the functions are to survival. So when we're talking about down low, the brain develops bottom to top. So we're talking about down low in the brain. These are things like breathing, circulation, right? The things that we can't survive without. As we move up toward the diencephalon, we're talking about drives, hunger, thirst, sleep, you know. So kids who are born premature that have a little less development in those areas of the brain, they might not be as well regulated with regard to those kinds of things, hunger and sleep and things like that. They might need more support in those early years. As we move further up the brain into the limbic system, this is the emotional and relational area of the brain. This area of the brain grows the fastest during these early childhood years, right? And so it begins with the attachment to the primary caregiver. I know all of you are familiar with this. You know, you've studied Bowlby and Ainsworth. You know about attachment. You know about how that first year is a pretty critical year for attachment. And that if attachment doesn't happen initially in that first year, that kids have more issues. I mean, it doesn't mean that attachment can't happen later, but it becomes more complicated. My wife and I adopted a child who had been very severely neglected. We adopted her when she was 8. And that wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to facilitate a good, solid attachment bond. She's 11 now, and she's, I'm happy to say, pretty securely attached to mom and dad. But I know, and we've said, you know, to ourselves many times, gosh, it would have been so much better if we would have been able to get her when she was a baby. You know, we mourn those years. And one reason that we do is because that attachment would have been so much more efficient and so much quicker and more effective if it had happened when the brain was more malleable. Right? When this area of the brain was more malleable. The limbic system is where the attachment center of the brain. It's also where our amygdalas are located. The amygdala, you might not know that word, but you're very familiar with what it does, because the kids in your room that still lay down on the floor and throw big raucous tantrums, They've got very active amygdalas in that moment, right? The amygdala is the area of the brain that's responsible for fear and anger. And when that area of the brain lights up, you pretty much just have to write it out, don't you, until it calms down. Because you can be using all kinds of logic with that child. Now, you're going to lose more privileges if you keep screaming and laying on the floor. They're not processing any of it. Guess what? When all the energy goes from the language centers of the brain to the amygdala, these areas of the brain shut off. And that's why, we could tell the kids, keep it up and you'll never get to do anything fun for the rest of your lives. There's some, they're not going to stop because they don't listen to that. The logical area of the brain's not working. The amygdala is what's lit up, right? So it might not surprise you then to know that kids that have those kinds of huge tantrums most likely are still struggling with the development of that limbic system of the brain. There's hope in those early childhood years. There's hope for those kids, but they're going to need some help building up that system. And then we have the neocortex. This is the last area of the brain to develop, and in fact, it's still developing in all of us when we learn something new, right? This part of the brain can still be, at least parts of it, can still be rewired. Thank God, even for us, because sometimes we get new research or we learn something new and we say, oh, I didn't know that. And if we couldn't continue to grow in our neocortex, we would say, but I've got to disregard that because I'm finished up here, Thank goodness we don't have to do that. But some key findings on brain development. Dr. Pam Schiller at the University of Houston, looking at the work of Dr. Perry, concludes these things. Brain development is contingent on a complex interaction between genes and the environment. See, we used to have this raging debate in child development, and perhaps you've heard it or studied about it. Is it nature or is it nurture, right? Is it primarily the genes that people are born with that directs their behavior and their outcomes, or is it their environment? And there are strong, arguments on both sides. And science has now definitively answered that question. Is it nature or nurture? And the answer is yes. It is both of those things, because our nature and nurture interact with each other, right? Early interactions, early experiences can contribute significantly to the structure of the brain and its capacities, right? So if we say this child is acting this way because of how his brain is or isn't wired, that doesn't mean that the wiring can't change, because early experiences contribute significantly to the structure of the brain and its capacities. The quality, the quantity, and the consistency of stimulation is key here. I remember one time sitting in a workshop with Dr. Bruce Perry, and Dr. Perry said, hey, when you're in the grocery store and somebody's holding a baby, or there's a baby sitting in the grocery cart facing you, but the adult is facing the other way, and the baby is like really checking you out, like, I haven't seen this one before. Who is that, right? And because nobody's taught them yet that it's not polite to stare, because you can't, because it's a baby, right? And so the baby is looking at you, and I know, you're early childhood people, I know what you do. You don't look away like, I don't know this baby. No, you're there waving at them, aren't you? Smiling, hi, that's what you're doing. And Dr. Perry says, always do that. You know why? Because when babies have that kind of reciprocal interaction, we can actually see new axons and dendrites growing together in the brain. That changes the structure of their brains, right? So when you're smiling and winking at that baby and waving at that baby, you're contributing to that baby's healthy emotional development. You're contributing to the building up of the limbic system in that child, the attachment center of the brain, right? Those early experiences affect how the brain is. This is why early childhood teachers are the most important teachers in the school. Don't ever let anybody make you feel otherwise, because you are building that structure of the brain that's going to then, no pressure, but going to affect everything that they do from then on, even into adulthood. Children learn in the context of relationships. If I were to ask you, what made you decide to become an educator? What made you decide to grow up and work with kids, I bet a lot of you would mention some experience you had in early childhood, some person, a teacher, who really made a difference in your life, right? You know, one reason why I'm interested in preschool education is because one of the teachers I have a very vivid memory of was my teacher when I was 3 years old. And I remember how warm and sweet, I don't remember anything I learned, but I remember how warm and sweet and thoughtful and caring. I remember her smile, you know. I remember how excited I was to be there and the fun things that we would do. Children learn in the context of relationships. And brain development is not linear, even though sometimes we teach it that way in those Child Development 101 courses. And learning can continue across the lifespan. But there are windows of opportunity. There are windows of opportunity. So let's talk a little bit about the windows of opportunity. And what I mean by windows of opportunity, the times when that particular area of the brain responsible for whatever function is most malleable, what we call neuroplasticity, right? Most moldable. Remember, that's why you're the most important teachers in the school. And so for emotional intelligence, including attachment, the optimal window is at 0 to 24 months, those first 2 years of life. The way that adults in that baby's life respond to that baby, pick up that baby when he or she is crying, give them something to eat when they're hungry, let them know that they're loved, that makes a big difference in how their emotions and their emotional regulation develop and their ability to relate to other people develops. But we know that some kids don't have great environments with all of that in the first 2 years of life. There's another window of opportunity. The next best opportunity is in those ages from 2 to 5 years. And there's further rewiring possible at any age. Thank God for my daughter that there is, because you know, we've had a lot to work on with her, but she's making progress. And so that further rewiring is possible, but the younger the better, because the brain is more moldable. There's more neuroplasticity. With regard to motor development, optimal window is 0 to 24 months. Next best opportunity is 2 to 5 years, but further rewiring decreases with age. Now, if I'd been watching the men's gymnastics during the Olympics and I said, oh, I think I could do that, I just need to take some lessons. I'll work really hard at it. I'll be at the 2028 Olympics. You guys are laughing, and there's a reason why. Because I can't do that, right? because after a certain point, not only does your body fail you, but also even learning those motor skills that are new motor skills, the ability to do that would decline as well. Vision. First best opportunity, 0 to 2 years. Next best opportunity is 2 to 5 years. But you know what? If a child spends the first 5 years of their life in a cave with no light, they will be blind, because the wiring of the brain just wasn't done when it needed to be done. Early sounds, optimal window 4 to 8 months, next best opportunity 8 months to 5 years. Further rewiring is possible with any age, but it gets a little trickier. So if we're thinking about language, for example, certain languages have sounds that other languages don't have. There are sounds in some languages that don't exist in English, right? And if we learn a new language today that has sounds in it that we've never been exposed to, chances are we will always speak that with a very discernible American accent, right? You know, we could learn the vocabulary really well. We could practice the sounds a lot. We could go over to Cambodia or Japan and try to speak our Japanese or our Khmer, and they would say, "You're American, right?" And it wouldn't just be how we look, it's because they know, because we sound American. But you get a child before age 5, and you put them in a language immersion program, and they learn the sounds of that language, they can speak it like they've always spoken it, can't they, right? So sounds, music, and then higher order thinking skills. So look at the optimal window here, those higher order thinking and problem solving skills. Remember, that was the other difference between students on the PSIA high school assessment. The high performing countries and us. The big differences were, number one, the high-performing country students were more motivated. We were less motivated. Number two, the high-performing students had better critical thinking skills, better higher-order thinking skills. Look at the optimal window for the development of critical thinking skills. The optimal window is 0 to 48 months, but how do we do it? Well, we know how we do it. Let Yale and Cambridge and all those Ivy League universities tell you how to do it because they've studied it. The way we do it is through child-initiated play-based activities. Okay, so Clancy Blair, in an article in the American Psychologist, did an article about school readiness, because this is what we hear very often in early childhood, right? You know, but how does this all kind of relate to school readiness and that readiness for the academic schools? Well, we got some insight about that through Dr. Marcon's work, but later, this is what Clancy Blair wrote. Based on recent data and brain research, he proposed a neurobiological model of school readiness, the implications of which are that preschool programs are best when they focus on social, emotional, and intellectual goals rather than narrow academics. Blair's analysis emphasizes the positive role of early experiences that provoke self-regulation, initiative, and what he calls synchronous interaction, in which the child is interactive with others rather than a mere passive recipient of isolated bits of information. You know, what he's describing here is an active learning approach, right? Kids don't learn best through worksheets and workbooks. In fact, the data shows us that if we really want to turn kids off to a subject, hand them a workbook, hand them a worksheet, right? That's not how young kids learn best. That's not how preschool and kindergarten age kids learn. They learn through active learning approaches, through multisensory methodologies. And Lillian Katz says, on the basis of Clancy Blair's model, an intellectually rather than academically focused approach is most likely to yield desirable school readiness. So intellectually rather than academically. What does that mean? That means we're focusing on brain development and brain skills, not on academic markers. You know, not on, you know, how many words they can sight read, but rather, you know, are we developing the language areas of the brain so that they'll have the comprehension that they need by the 4th grade and the self-regulation skills. An intellectually rather than academically focused approach is most likely to yield desirable school readiness as well as longer-term benefits related to the goals of STEM education. So if we really want to meet those goals, by the time we're in 4th grade, we've got to focus on building up the brain connections that they need when they're in early childhood. So how do we do that? I'm going to walk you through now some different areas of the brain, and I think that you'll probably, as we talk about this, get better at identifying the areas of the brain that are associated with some of the skills that some of your learners need to work on. So those kids that are not well regulated, that come in either under-aroused, half asleep, or really hyper-aroused, who start asking what time is lunch at 9:15, those kids that just don't seem to have that good self-regulation, we need to work on further developing the brainstem and the diencephalon. So how do we do that? That happens through patterned, or patterned if you'd like, repetitive somatosensory activities. Music and movement, breathing, drumming, other activities involving tactile input, right? So repeat after me. So you can do things like that when you're lined up, getting ready to go from the classroom to the gym. Or if you're trying to quiet the kids down in a circle time before you have a class discussion together. These kinds of things are breathing in and out before rest time, those pattern breathing, trying to breathe slowly. Those kinds of things help develop the brainstem and the diencephalon. Exercise builds the brain. Use music and movement every day. Make exercise bands from links of fabric. Dance with streamers and scarves. Have you ever done that before? Give kids like 2 or 3 feet of streamer, put on some music and let them go. dance around with the streamers and the scarves. Walk on balance beam or tape on the floor. Not a beam like Simone Biles goes on, but like something really low to the ground, or tape on the floor. Have children imitate stretches that cross the midline to connect those hemispheres of the brain. So doing, songs like those classics, Where is Thumbkin, Itsy Bitsy Spider, but vary those to cross the arms across the midline. Books like, and I'm going to give you the classics here because if I try to stay current, then they go out of print, right? But these will always be there for you. And they're new to these kids, right? They've never read these books. From Head to Toe by Eric Carle, Clap Your Hands by Lorinda Colley, stuff like that. Play marching music and invite the children to create different marching steps, high steps, fast steps, long steps. Provide musical instruments for exploration. Hopefully you're not like right next to a cranky 6th grade teacher in the building or something like that. I don't know how well that'll work. But the musical instruments, that can get a little bit loud. But provide musical instruments for exploration. Encourage expressive art to music. Give them some art materials and then say, I'm going to put on some music and just, draw or create whatever you're hearing in the music. Just see where it leads you. Roll a ball to music. Use music for transitions. So I met my wife when she was a pre-K teacher. She taught a pre-K 5 class, and I did summer camp at the same Child Development Center in the summers in between my undergrad years. And so I was coming back around spring break because I wanted to check in with the director there and talk about the summer and stuff. And she said, oh, you've got to meet Miss Anna, our new preschool teacher, our new pre-K teacher. And so she took me back to meet Anna, and my first impression of her, she puts on Twist and Shout by the Beatles. All the kids immediately drop what they're doing and start cleaning everything up and organizing everything. And by the end, they're all sitting on this one line in the room, and I'm thinking, this is my kind of woman right here, right? And they were well practiced using music for transitions, and they knew Twist and Shout was the cleanup song. So, when Twist and Shout came on, they had to start putting their things away. They had to be finished with it and sitting on the line by the end of the song. Every once in a while, some kids, some wise guys would go over there and sit on the line at the beginning of the song, and she would say, oh no, you were over there in that block center, you go clean up those blocks before you sit on the line, right? But eventually the whole room was clean, everybody was on the line, and she never had to nag anybody, she never had to say, okay, come on, none of that, because they knew when that song came on, the song was the transition time. Right? So use music for transitions. Use books like Down by the Bay by Rafi, Old MacDonald Had a Farm by Robert Quackenbush. For development of the limbic system, probably none of you have kids that aren't well self-regulated when it comes to emotions and stuff like that. Probably they're really doing well on developing empathy and stuff for others. But if not, if they need to work on that limbic system, for skills to manage anger and frustration, for mood regulation, social relatedness, and the beginning of planning skills and self-direction, because it takes some frustration management to do that, then try the following. Try lots of empathic reflections. So you want to, when you see that child get really, really frustrated and look like he's going to hit another child, you want to intervene quickly, but you say, it's really frustrating, isn't it, when he comes and just grabs your toy like that because you were using that. You're feeling so frustrated. Right? Give that empathic reflection. What does that do? It serves as kind of a dampener for that feeling. And it even works with adults, doesn't it? Right? When somebody's really frustrated, if you really want them to calm down, the best thing you can say is, oh, that's no big deal, calm down, right? No. No. That is not I know from experience, that is not the thing to do, right? What you do is you reflect the feeling that you're seeing. Wow, I can see you're really feeling frustrated. What's going on, right? And when we are able to share that feeling with somebody else, it helps us regulate ourselves. And it helps this child to learn to regulate, helps them to learn to put it into language, right? So lots of empathic reflections. Child-initiated play, again, remember, also builds the limbic system. It also builds self-regulation capacities. Expressive art. calming, regulating sensory play like Play-Doh or working in the sensory tables. I know many of you don't want to think about using sand, but maybe at least we could do rice or dried beans or something, in those sensory tables. Or water tables if you're really brave and you have some good smocks. Build thinking skills. So remember the higher order thinking skills we want to focus on building, because it's one of the big differences between the high school students in other countries that are achieving more than us and our high school students. Is that area of the brain, that problem-solving, thinking, higher-order thinking area of the brain is less well-developed. So we want to reverse that trend and really begin working on that when that part of the brain is most malleable in those early childhood years. So doing things like rearranging toys and equipment, rotating books on the reading center shelves as well as toys, rearranging the furniture. Have them color on paper taped to a table or a window. That gives a whole different effect and introduces some other kinds of creativity and adaptability. Cut easel paper into creative shapes and see what they can make out of the shapes. Read Wacky Wednesday and try working backwards one day. Create new verses to familiar songs. Work puzzles upside down. So maybe they've mastered this puzzle. Now turn it upside down and try it, right? So we want to help promote that cognitive flexibility. Why? Because this is one of the key ingredients in higher order problem solving skills, is the cognitive flexibility. Some other things we can do. Place unusual items together. Dishes with blocks, Legos with art supplies, and see what happens. Do you recognize the artist over here? Whose work is that? Yeah, you think it's Eric Carle. Let me tell you, this was done by my kindergarten age goddaughter. And here's when it was done. One day, the art teacher just put in some new supplies, some new things to make textures. She had some bubble wrap in there and stuff. And for the first time, my goddaughter looked at that and said, oh, I could do this kind of picture like in my Eric Carle books. And then she did. We had no idea she could do that kind of stuff. This looks even better when you really see it on screen, and because the colors really pop too. We had no idea, and obviously she has some fine motor skills that some of the other kindergartners didn't have. But we never would have known that she had that talent had she not been given the room for that kind of creativity. So we've got to let kids have the creative space to be able to discover their own talents as well. Change the names of traditional games. This also helps promote cognitive flexibility. Novelty promotes cognitive flexibility. Play Lucy Says instead of Simon Says. Play Rooster Rooster Monkey instead of Duck Duck Goose. Just varying things like that can help promote cognitive flexibility. I didn't tell you this part. My daughter also is on the autism spectrum. She's very high functioning on the autism spectrum, so you don't really know by interacting with her for a few minutes, but try to change the routine on her and see what happens. Right? Because she likes everything to happen a certain exact, precise way. We brought a bunch of hot Cheetos with us when we're in the middle of a series of different trips right now, and I made a little excursion up to Minnesota during that. But it was all planned. That was on the schedule before, so don't think that I interrupt my family vacations to do that. We already knew it was happening. Anyway, but when we left home, we had to bring a bunch of little packets of hot Cheetos because it's just not worth it. When it's snack time, which is exactly 10:30 every day, my daughter wants her hot Cheetos. And some things we kind of push her on cognitive flexibility with. This one is not high on the list right now. But we know when we introduce these kinds of elements, when we call something different, when we rearrange something, it's a good way to work on cognitive flexibility. And every once in a while we run out of hot chips, and I purposely don't go to the grocery store in time to buy them. Why? Because I want to help her just kind of stretch her brain a little bit. Let's think of something else we can have for snack, okay? Because there's a hole burning in your stomach. All right. Building thinking skills. Look for visual patterns in the environment, lines in the carpet, Patterns or patterns in nature. Make sure kids have many experiences that teach likenesses and differences. Read books and stories that have a repetitive pattern. Now I'm saying pattern. Like Brown Bear, What Do You See by Bill Martin, The Three Little Pigs. Sing songs that have a pattern. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes, This Old Man, stuff like that. Make up simple dances with patterns. Create clapping patterns like what we were doing earlier. Discuss the patterns of the body, the in and out motion of breathing, the rhythm of heartbeat and pulse. Help kids identify patterns in clothing like plaids and stripes and dots. Create patterns using the children. For example, one child faces forward, one back, one forward, one back, and then talk about the pattern. You read books like Goodnight Moon, The Very Busy Spider, The Doorbell Rang. All of those books have patterns that the kids can recognize there. For building those problem-solving skills, ask questions about stories and other things that happen throughout the day to encourage higher order thinking skills. Ask what-if questions with concrete scenarios. What if red were the only color? How would the world be different? What if the kids were in charge of parents and teachers instead of the other way around? They were like, that sounds great, right? But the more we talk about it, the more it may not sound great. How do we get groceries? Things like that. Encourage children to compare and contrast. How's a bird different from a cat? How are they the same? Provide activities that require exercising judgment. Do you think all these marbles will fit in this jar? Who thinks they will? Who thinks they won't? Let's try it out. Let's see. Show kids 5 blocks of different sizes. Ask them to build a tower. And now, is there more than one way to build it? Now let's try to build a different kind of tower from the same blocks. Place 2 strips of masking tape on the floor of the ping pong ball. Ask the kids to find a way to move the ping pong ball from one line to the other without touching it. I have an activity that I do with kids. It's actually part of our religion curriculum, Alleluia, that is called How Can I Help? And one of the things that we do is we want to teach kids to look, not just to be willing to help others, but to look for ways to help others, right? To discover that in their everyday lives. And so we'll hide a baby doll on one side of the room and a blanket over here. And we might have a little stuffed animal dog here and a plastic dog bowl there. We might have some spilled markers and a marker case laying nearby. And I might go to the baby and say, oh, look at this little baby, isn't she cute? Oh, I think she's shivering. I think she's cold. Can anybody find a way to help? And they look all around the room, they find the blanket, and they come and wrap the baby doll up. And oh, look at this cute little puppy. Look at him. Oh, he's telling me something. Oh, you know what he said? He said, I'm so hungry. I wonder if anybody can find a way to help. And they look around the room and they find the dog bowl and bring it to the dog. These kinds of scenarios where they can kind of discover it themselves and work together that way. You've heard of, probably in your studies at least, the Reggio Emilia method, where we encourage kids to sort of begin with a question and we just sort of follow them where they might lead us. This is not probably a great way to do education in general. I'm not a die-hard Reggio Emilia kind of guy, but there's space for that occasionally, especially if we want to build problem-solving skills, for using that approach every once in a while, for just kind of following a question and letting the kids begin to think creatively about it. Using books like Stone Soup by Marcia Brown or Swimming by Leo Lionni. So what does the developmentally appropriate early childhood classroom look like? It probably has some supplies or an area for fine motor skills development, like Legos and bristle blocks and things like that. It probably has a gross motor component to it, maybe not in the room because there's not enough space to do that, but maybe in other places where you go. A science or a nature center with some little magnifying glasses and little things that they might be looking at or thinking about or studying during that time in science. Maybe you're on an ocean unit, and so there are some seashells and sea sponges and things like that over there that they can look at up close. A reading, literacy, writing readiness kind of center. So when we talk about how do we do this, you know that in, for example, an NAEYC accredited early childhood classroom, everything is labeled, right? We have the word for everything. I remember the first time I walked into a NAEYC accredited pre-K classroom, and I was like, oh, chair, door, window, everything is labeled because it's part of creating a literature-enriched environment. It's part of promoting those early literacy skills. So we want to do that. We want to have a writing center where there are letters posted and lots of different kinds of writing supplies, stationery, and different pencils that they can use and things like that, and envelopes. And they will be over there naturally copying those letters that they see and writing little letters that are mostly intelligible only to them, to mom and dad and to you. But it's great practice with the writing and the fine motor skills as well, right? Writing readiness. We want to have an arts or a creative kind of center. We want to have opportunities for socialization. We want to have music because of all the wonderful things music does to develop the brain. So what are the implications of all this for religious education? One thing I love about speaking to an audience that works in Catholic school environments is that we also get to talk about that. And here's what I see. Even in places where everything is done just the way we talked about, where people really know the research and they have a great child-initiated environment and there are lots of wonderful things happening in different centers. When it's time for the religion lesson, everybody has to sit down at a table with a worksheet, right? And what does that say to those young learners? That says the one thing that is more boring than anything else is your faith, right? So we're going to come sit here and do this boring thing to learn about it. I don't like that. A good religion lesson for early childhood should be multisensory, it should be active, it should be playful and imaginative, and it should be child-initiated as well. How do we do it? Well, my wife and I struggled with that question. When we first got into Catholic religious education, first as volunteer catechists and then working in religious education in other capacities, we decided that there wasn't much out there. We like Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, but it takes a lot of money and resources to have an atrium. It takes lots and lots and lots of hours of training for anybody who's certified in the methodology. And we said, what can we do here that would be a little simpler? And so we developed a religion curriculum called Allelu that has child-initiated components in every lesson. The first thing that people asked when they saw Allelu is, where's the kids' workbook? You know what my answer is. There isn't one. There isn't one. Now, there is a sheet that goes home to parents that is really a placemat for the family meal and gives parents some prompts to talk to kids about what they're learning in religion class, and it has some things on there for kids to do. But what they do in the classroom really happens in the different centers and in circle time, and it's more active learning activities because that's what they need. So some concluding thoughts. The deployment of, this is, I'll give you who said this in just a minute, but the deployment of unsupported, potentially harmful pedagogies is particularly pernicious. He's using good alliteration there. Particularly pernicious at the early childhood level. It's during the early childhood years, ages 4 to 7, when children's basic attitudes toward themselves as students and towards learning and school are established. Children who come through this period feeling good about themselves, who enjoy learning and who like school, will have a lasting appetite for the acquisition of skills and knowledge. Children whose academic self-esteem is all but destroyed during these formative years, who develop an antipathy toward learning and a dislike of school, will never fully realize their latent abilities and talents. If we want all of our children to be the best that they can be, we must recognize that education is about them, not us. If we do what's best for children, we will give them and their parents the developmentally appropriate, high quality, affordable, and accessible early childhood education they both need and deserve. This is David Elkin, Professor of Child Development at Tufts University, another major center for child development. And I'm going to close with that. If you'd like to take a look at Allelu, Mike Habib, who is your OSV rep, is here. Allelu, again, is a hands-on active learning approach to religion class. We have a pre-K3, pre-K4, and kindergarten level of Allelu. I do not have a curriculum that I worked on in any capacity for general education subjects in the classroom, but I really like HighScope because it's very consistent with the research, and they keep updating it based on current research. So that's one thing I like if you're looking for things. But if you'd like to order a free sample of Allelu, you can scan that, or you can talk to Mike. And that's all I have today. I want to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.